All right, so we are going to talk a little bit about how to create what are called washes in this lesson here. Your first watercolor assignment, we talked about some fun ways to create different effects with watercolor painting, adding soap, salt, painting with different materials like a toothbrush or a sponge, how to create and preserve white areas with a wax resist, using the crayons, things like that. Okay, so we're going to build on that by focusing on two different techniques that I found are really, there we go, that's a little bit better, that are you're going to use quite often as you paint, and that's to use washes. A wash is technically an area of paint where you apply paint all at the same time and it remains wet until you're done, and then you let it dry. So you can have what is called a flat wash, and this is an example of a painting that was made using only flat washes into these different shapes here. You can see each area is one flat, even tone, even color. It doesn't go from light to dark. It doesn't change from one color to another. It's just nice and flat and even. So there'll be many times in a painting where you want to create that effect. You want a nice, flat, even tone of color, and like on buildings, but abstract paintings, I mean, there's just really lots of different uses for that. But this is an example of what the flat, or use of a flat wash in a painting. The other example, which is a little trickier to use, but also can be very expressive in your painting, is called a graded wash. And a graded wash is when your area of paint goes from light to dark, like you can see here in the sky. You get these lighter tones going into these darker tones. You can also see that on his cloak here of this guy's jacket. You can see these light areas that gradually change into another color, and even in a darker tone as well. So this is example of using graded washes in a painting. So you're going to use both of those techniques, and they take a little bit more practice than what we did with our first assignment. And so that's what we're going to focus on with this project here, is how to create a flat wash and a graded wash. So the first thing you're going to need to grab is a piece of watercolor paper. So you need to grab one of your blank sheets of paper and draw this out. Okay, I'll give you some time if you need to pause the video to draw this out, but you're going to divide it into 4 squares, 4 equal sections. In one square, just leave blank. Don't do anything to that one square there. The other square, you're going to divide that up into 8 smaller squares. So just take this one square, split it in half, and then split it in half and split it in half. So you get 8 squares. It doesn't have to be exact. Mine looks kind of measured out, but I didn't really mean it to be that way. So if it's it doesn't have to be super perfect on this one. I just want to see the 8 squares on there. The lower 2 squares here, you're going to draw a little window that we're going to do something with. And then over here, I want you to draw a cube in 3D. Okay, a 3-dimensional cube. So go ahead and pause the video, and you can to draw this out. And when you're ready to go, then you can hit play again. I'm going to jump right into it since mine is already done. So first, we're going to practice doing a couple flat washes. Okay, this tends to be a little challenging to do. Because you have to get it nice and even. So what you're going to do to create a flat wash here, we're going to paint this whole area in with one shade of color. Okay, one color. And so the first thing I want to do is make sure I mix enough paint to be able to cover this entire area. If I have to go back and stop because I ran out of paint and mix some more, it's going to start to dry, and I'm not going to be able to go back and get an even application of paint. So I want to make sure that I mix enough. I'm going to use green. You can choose any color you want to. Pick your favorite color. Green is my favorite color. And I'm going to use this color here. It's called sap green. I really like that green. It's kind of a nice, warm green. Okay, I want a nice big puddle. So lots of paint here. I don't want to run the risk of running out of paint. If anything, when you're mixing paint, you always mix more than you think you're going to use, especially if you're mixing a special kind of color like a skin tone. I always want to make sure I mix plenty of that because I don't want to have to go back and try to mix it and match that exact color because it's going to look very splotchy on my painting. So I always want to make sure I mix plenty of paint. And so this is a good amount of paint here for this area. Okay? Let's get a little bit more color in there too, so it shows up a little nicer. Okay, evenly mix it out. I'm going to use my large brush for this, and I'm going to load my brush completely. Okay, I'm going to soak up as much water as I can without it dripping. So sometimes if I lift it up, I can see it's going about to drip. So I just kind of touch the end of my brush onto my palette, just so I make sure it's not going to drip, because I don't want to carry my brush over my painting and then have it drip where I don't want it to drip. Then, because there's not much you can do to fix that. So when you've got your brush loaded with paint, I'm going to start over here on one side here and begin applying the paint onto the paper. You can see that it's going to work back and forth, and then when I can see it's starting to run low on paint, I just simply reload my brush and keep moving. Sometimes you may have to go back and forth, depending on the quality of your paper. If you have really cheap paper, this is harder and you may get some streaks to it. So if you have some streakiness to it, I don't want you to panic, because also some colors also are harder to work with as well. And they don't spread nice and evenly like this one here does. So some colors have a heavier pigment to them, and so the pigment settles faster. But you want to make sure you keep it nice and even all the way across. Okay? If you have to go back and work on an area because one spot dried out, you can. Just do it really quick and make sure your paper stays evenly wet. You don't want any puddles. See, I'm almost out of paint here, which is good because I'm just about finished. You don't want to have any puddles. If you do start to get some puddles, and typically when I lift up my brush here, I'll show you, well, yeah, I'll start to get some puddles. You can kind of spread that out a little bit, but only if your paper is still wet. So if your paper dries out any part while you're doing this, you may have to go back and just get some clean water and reapply the paint onto your paper. So I just dropped a little bit of water there, which is not good. Anyway, so you want to try to get nice and even and smooth. So while this is drying, we're going to go to another area. Look, like get the running technique right there because I dropped. Oops. So if that does happen, this is how you would fix it, which is actually a good thing. So I'm just going to go back and reapply some paint. And even that out. Okay, but I have to go over the whole thing so I don't get any streaks. Okay. Now, some of those will settle out as the paint begins to dry. Then the pigment will kind of to separate and even out. So if it does have a little bit of streakiness to it, some of that will even out as it dries. So while that's drying, I can't work here, and I can't work on these here because this is still wet. If I put paint on here right now, it's just going to run into that. So part of learning how to paint is learning about timing. Learning how long to wait and let something dry. You know it's dry when you look at it and there's no longer any shininess to it, okay? So once the shininess has gone away, then you can go in and paint, add some more. So in this section over here, I'm going to create a value scale, okay? So it's going to go from light white all the way to a dark color here. So you can pick any color you want to, but I would recommend you pick one of the darker colors. It's a little easier to do. If you pick one of these lighter colors like this yellow here or any of these tan colors here, you're going to have to actually add a second color to darken it up to get the full 8 color or 8 value separation. So I'm going to try using this brown color here. Brown's not the people's favorite colors, but yeah, it'll work. So I'm going to mix a little bit onto my palette over here. I've got a little bit on here, which is why I'm going to use it. Add some water to it. And it's also really handy to have a piece of scratch paper so you can test it out. So if you mix it on your palette, sometimes you think it's one color, but when you actually put it down onto a piece of paper, you can actually see what it's going to look like. Okay, so you can see how dark that color actually is going to be. Okay, so that's about what I want. I want it actually a little bit lighter, so I'm going to add just a tiny bit more water to it. Then I'm going to come over here, move that out of the way. Still. And in this section here, I'm going to apply flat wash of this one color here that I mixed. We're going to leave the top one white. Don't paint in the top one here. As you remember, we talked about in our first watercolor assignment, if you want something white when you're painting with watercolors, you don't paint it, you paint around it. So the first one we're going to leave white. The second one we're going to apply this light color to it. Okay? And each one is progressively going to get darker and darker as we go down. Okay? So while this is drying, I probably shouldn't have done that, I smeared that a little bit. So while this is drying, we're going to come back and work on some other spots and jump around a little bit. So I'll probably divide this video into two sections so that it's not such a big file, a big video. And if you only need to see the second half, you can only watch the second half. So I'm going to do just a little bit here, and then we'll probably split the video in two. So this is still drying over here. So while this is drying, let's jump down to this one over here, and we'll apply the first layer of paint. Now this one here, we're going to use what's called a graded wash. And the graded wash is going to be go from light to dark. And so we're going to practice making some light to dark values in this to make this box look three-dimensional. Okay, you can see we've drawn in the shadow over here, so that means that the light is coming in from this direction over here. The light's coming in this way. The top of the box is going to be brighter than this side of the box. Okay, the light is being blocked from hitting over here, so this is going to be darker. So we're going to first start off painting this lighter, and we'll paint the tabletop area here also light. And then we'll go in with some darker colors as this starts to dry. Okay, so let's pick red on this one. So I'm going to start out with mixing this really light color, this red, add a little bit of brown to it, get a nice kind of there, and then test it out. So that's about the color I'm going to start with. Okay, you can pick any color you want to, but make sure you kind of keep it light. It's always easier to make it darker. Like I can make this darker super easy by applying more color to it, but I can't make it lighter. It's really hard to go back and try to make this a lighter color after the fact. Okay, so let's see, mix this lighter version here, and I'm going to start off by painting in too much paint on that. There we go. I'm going to start off by painting this area here. Use the tip of my brush to get around these tight corners. And then I can push down with my brush to cover a larger area. Okay? So I've painted this whole area in. It's nice and wet. I'm going to keep it all nice and wet. And while this is still wet, I'm going to take a little bit of some more paint and just kind of tap it into this corner here. So it's a little bit darker on this end over here. Okay? Now that's a little too much. So, and I did that so that you can see how to fix that. So if you get it too dark, then I can clean off my brush like this. And you got to work quickly here. And so it picks up a little bit of that paint, but also kind of spreads it out a little bit. Okay? So it's a little bit darker on one end and lighter on the other end. So I get this gradation. Okay? So we'll put that in, let that dry, because I can't paint around it because I can see it's going to touch right here and here. So I'm going to actually cheat for a minute. Use my heat gun. Okay, check, make sure it made it. Wait and see if the shininess is gone. Yep, so now it's good to go. So now I'm going to go in and paint this area here in. If you have a blow dryer, you can use that, or just wait for it to dry. Sometimes you're just literally sitting watching paint dry. Okay, pick up a little bit more water there. Paint this whole area here in. Don't need to paint in the shadow there. Come in over here. I'll use my big brush to do most of this. If you use your small brush to do all this, you're going to have to reload it so many times that you're not going to get an even coverage of paint. So don't use your small brush when you're trying to do these washes here. That's why I've given you the larger brush here. Now this is starting to dry out a little bit, so I have to go back and pick up some more water. So I want this all to be wet as I paint it. So I have to go back and re-wet it just a little bit here, some of these spots. Okay, then pick up a little bit more paint, a little bit darker paint, and kind of tap it in these corners here, just so I can kind of darken up. Let's put a little bit darker paint. Just a little bit, don't overdo it. So it's darker around the edges here, and gets a little bit lighter towards the middle. Now, if you do make a mistake, you can clean it up, pick it up. If you have a tissue or some toilet paper or rag handy, you can kind of take that. As you can see, I can kind of dab some of that up to get really light around here if I wanted to. Okay, but it only works if it's still wet. All right, now we'll let that dry. While that's drying, let's go back up here and paint another road up here. So pick up again some of this brown. I got to add some more color to it. Take my scratch paper here, and that's the first one I mixed, and so I want to make sure the second one is going to be darker, and that's good. I want it nice, so I can see the difference between the two. If it's too similar to the one above it, then I need to add more paint. I want to see that you can control how dark your colors get. So while this is drying over here, I'm going to try to carefully not put my hand in it like I did the green square. Paint in this next row. You can see when I get to the corners, I try to go really slow. Just pull my brush around so that it stays in the lines as much as possible. If you're going outside the lines a little bit, it's not going to be a big deal for this project. But as you get more practice, obviously you're going to want to be able to do that. Okay? So now I got 3 different shades of brown. Eventually it's going to get really dark once we get to that part right there. Okay, so let this dry. While this is drying, it looks like this is still just a little bit wet. Wait for that to dry there, but while that's drying, I can see that this started to dry here and created a little bit of an edge right there. Okay, sometimes that happens. You can, if you have decent quality paper, you can go back and kind of soften that edge back up with just applying some water to it. So I'm just going to pick up just a little bit of water, try to blend that out just a little bit. Okay, I don't want to put too much water because then it'll make just another area grow bigger there. But you can kind of go back and clean things up just a little bit. Okay, that is nice and dry. I don't see any more shiny to it, so I know it's dry. So over here, we're going to apply a graded wash. Okay, and we're going to start off by, each of you should have a white crayon in either your little bag or something you pick up from school. If you didn't pick one up, you don't have one, then make sure you get one before you do this, because we're going to do this and to remind you that when you start to paint something, the first thing you need to think about, are there any white areas I need to preserve with either my masking fluid or my crayon? The best way to do this is to use the masking fluid, but because this is just a practice, let's just use the white crayon to do this. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I want to create like a little highlight across the edge here, so it makes it look like this part of the window frame sticks out a little bit. So I'm just going to push pretty hard here. Try not to break your crayon. Sometimes you do though. Make sure I get this totally covered in wax just across this top edge here. Not the whole square, but just the top edge here, because I want to make it look like light is hitting the edge there. And I can see I smudged that just a little bit. We'll cover some of that, get this right here. The top edge right here. And let's put a little bit of white right here. Okay, you really have to kind of go back and forth to make sure you cover all that paper. Sometimes the watercolor paper can be a little heavy.
Cassidy Bone and Mindy Madsen, please come to the main office. Cassidy Bone and Mindy Madsen, please come to the main office. Thank you.
Okay, then I'm going to do a graded wash on this area over here. So the graded wash is going to go from dark to light. Okay, there's lots of different ways to do this. You can start with a darker paint and then go in and put the lighter paint, but that's a little harder to control unless you have some experience. So what I'm going to do is we're going to paint this whole area in with the lighter paint, and then we're going to tap in and put in some of the darker paint and let it blend in with the rest of it. Okay, so to start out, I'm going to need to make sure I mix enough paint. So I'm mixing this. I'm going to use blue over here to make this graded wash. Make sure you have enough of it. You don't want to run out and have to go back and remix it, okay? But we're going to go with kind of a lighter shade of blue. So I'm going to add lots of water to it, test it out. Okay, so I'm going to go with about that shade right there. That's a really good light shade of blue. Gives me some range to go darker if I wanted to. Okay, so I'm going to load my brush with this paint. Make sure this up here is dry, this is dry. And go in over here now and start to lay in the paint here, working back and forth. Try to be really careful around those edges. You can see when I get to the wax, if this works right, the paint is not going to stick to the wax. Okay, may have to go back. So I want to make sure there's plenty of water on there. You want to have kind of this little puddle here to work with. So the paper doesn't dry out and it stays nice and even all the way across. So almost after every stroke, you need to go back and reload your brush. Go back and put some more water on that. Go. Give just a little bit more water. You have to do this in one shot too. If you stop and go get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, it's not going to work. You got to do this all at once. So make sure you have enough time, make sure you have enough paint, do this all in one shot. Okay, so nice, even, flat wash here. While this is still wet, now I'm going to go pick up some of my darker paint and put in some darker blue across the top here. And because it's still wet, I just let the paper do its own thing and just let the water do the mixing. Okay, so kind of go back and forth a little bit here and pick up some of this darker blue so you can clearly see that I'm going from dark to light. Okay, if you start to get a puddle somewhere, then have your paper handy that you can kind of go and dab, soak that up so it doesn't start to get out of control. Okay, but just kind of work it back and forth a little bit, bring it down. But the trick to get this to work right is to make sure your paper is all evenly wet the whole time you're painting. I can even go in and put some really dark across the top. And then just let it go. Okay? So dark to light across the top there. I'm going to let this go, let it dry. And then we'll come back and finish painting in the window here. Okay? So let's go back over here. We've got a couple more squares to do. I'm going to pause the video for right now and make a part 2. Okay?